So on behalf of Sarah and I, we wanted to talk with you just briefly about expertise and artistry within a particular group or groups in the university. We're coming at it from a background of educational development, extensive work both within our own universities and in the wider sector. We know that we've set out to champion the inclusiveness of the professional standards framework and indeed of the practices of people who occupy spaces within the university that are incredibly important to the student learning experience, but who don't wear the label of academic or faculty or whatever term that we're going to use. What we've acknowledged is their critical importance, but what we've also acknowledged is we've had to learn about those roles and how those roles operate in a way that is making the difference that we feel that we ought to better understand. That maybe didn't make complete sense, but let me have a go at explaining a little more. We're drawing from the literature, we're drawing from Helen's work around understanding the differentiated nature of expertise and needing to better understand it from the position of where you stand, knowing that there's richness in there. From Whitchurch's work and that of McIntosh and Nutt on third space professionals and their significance within that university context, but also the extent to which some roles within universities are less visible. They just necessarily are less visible. And at times, those people occupying those roles can feel uncomfortable within those positions. And we're drawing from Akerman there. And curiously, and we will pick that back up, how institutions themselves, when they're thinking about professional standards, recognition, still tend to talk about numbers, whether or not it's KPIs or whatever it is, that focus on academics and academic staff and their professional learning, their reward, their recognition. And of course, HESA and the data it captures and doesn't capture. So that's where we started. And the quote that you can see here is one that came actually from an Edinburgh Napier context. But what it started us thinking about ever more was the extent to which some people, some groups are marginalised. And if we look above the second pigeon, disregarded, ignored, overlooked, omitted, unheeded, unnoticed. For me, for some reason, the word unnoticed stands out. Marginalised, unsung. So for this presentation, we pulled together data that already existed, evaluatory data from University of Ulster, and then 2 pieces of research that I was involved in, and actually our own lived experience of working within our schemes and talking with individuals who come forward and those who choose not to. University of Ulster, very recent data, when asked these questions, or the question, why would somebody who doesn't need to gain fellowship do so, to be valued for my contribution to student learning, sitting at 88%, and then self-development, and at the bottom, encouraged. I kind of like the word, it's encouraged and not forced. So you can see there just a quick sense of why people would do it when they don't have to. And when asked the question, would you recommend fellowship? Indeed, they would. They would recommend it. However, what we acknowledge is that there are barriers and there are benefits within the fellowship experience, the process of leading up to it, and actually the gaining recognition. We're just going to talk a little about that. So barriers to engagement, we've already hinted at, that sense of marginalisation. For me, it raises a question that I'm still playing with, the extent to which people are marginalised themselves, or whether or not it's a complexity of both. But to be relegated to the fringes, out of the mainstream, made to seem unimportant. So that whether something happens in the sector itself that pushes people who are of critical importance to the university, to the students, to their learning, somehow we just miss. The language of the PSF itself, we looked at in a recent paper, and the extent to which you have to fight your way through some of it. And that's not me criticising the PSF, it's acknowledging that in trying to make it a very open framework, what it does is make some of the language seem obscure to others. And you can see here a quote from somebody talking about having to get inside the language. Is it for us? And we're drawing here or aligning with a paper from Cathcart et al. From the Australian context, and that sense of belonging and indeed of not belonging. The top quote I find fascinating because it's something to do with the individual appreciating their own value, which takes us beyond what Sarah and I talked about is us valuing people. It's about people valuing themselves. And in the second quote, what you can see is that sense of self-worth. If I stop and think about it, I'm quite disturbed that there are people in universities who do have those critical roles who are unsure of their worth. I need to think about that, and I remain disturbed by it. So the extent to which the process of coming through fellowship recognition and achieving recognition is experienced as legitimising the function, the way that they are, their role within the university, that which they do, which makes a difference. And actually within that, validating expertise. And I think it's in that it provokes me, it provokes Sarah, and it provokes us when we engage in conversations here, to think further about what do we mean by expertise in this context? How are we seeing it? What do we not see? And both Sarah and I have got a lot of experience of dialogic approaches to fellowship, which for me enable that expertise to come out of the flatness that is often what happens in written applications for fellowship, to actually become three-dimensional and to see behind role labels, to be able to understand that artistry, that expertise. So you've got a range of quotes here that you will be able to have a look at properly when you get the slide set. But that sense of people being able to experience a sense of being legitimate and of their expertise being validated. I think the word proud here is one that matters a lot to me. I think there is something about enabling people to feel pride in what they have done, what they achieve. Edinburgh Napier deliberately uses the word pride in its dialogic approach, and it was done really because we recognise that there's so many stories that are untold, and if you create space for people, they can talk about them, and that is across the boundaries of the university. The other thing that makes me think about when I look at these quotes is, who is the community? Who is the community of the university? I have a personal irritation. It is a Friday afternoon. I can be personally irritated that we talk so readily of community of practice. Who are the insiders? Who are the outsiders? Who are the people who maybe have a foot in one place and a foot in the other? And how beautiful it is that we had that construct of the bridge appearing before us in the session before. It makes me wonder about the people who matter and the people who matter less, or the people who maybe feel that they matter less, and maybe that's more important. Lots of thoughts are whirling in Sarah's and my heads at the moment. But the wider value and how enabling that range of people to come forwards to have their practice legitimised, for it to be recognised as that value-based understanding which sets out to know them and to better understand their contribution, and how even surfacing that of itself impacts the university. So there is something about people gaining a belief in themselves, the fact that they matter and what they do makes a difference, and the extent to which people who are ever more confident can actually enact their roles even more effectively. One person who I remember speaking with at Edinburgh Napier about 5 years ago now said that having gained fellowship recognition enabled her to get her feet under the right tables. How interesting. What are those right tables? The extent to which people have a sense of belonging. So what we would argue is that as we continue to build fellowship schemes, as people reaccredit, maybe as new institutions come on board, and indeed there are other forms of professional development opportunity, how much we need to think about the breadth of experience and of expertise in teaching and the support of learning practices, and the extent to which I own this, may have been blind to people who I don't see as easily, and people whose practice I don't understand as easily, but actually whose practices are speaking of expertise which challenges me to question my own. We have some references for you, and on that note I'm going to stop the slide share, and I managed to avoid the heart, I think.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you, Sarah, as well. Pretty much spot on. Yeah, wonderful. It was about 10 minutes, so thank you for that. Timing is great this afternoon. You're all putting me out of a job, I think. Some really lovely chat going on in the chat window, so lots of comments about this being fascinating. One of the questions I picked out first is somebody asked, have you looked at different departmental cultures to see whether this varies? So different departmental cultures or different institutional cultures?
I can speak to one particular department at Edinburgh Napier, which made me smile hugely, in that they deliberately set out to ensure that they, as a group of technicians working in biosciences, were recognised for their expertise in supporting students particularly within the laboratory setting, but actually more widely than that. But so as a body, they came forward, and their manager actually became a senior fellow, and all the other technicians became either associate or fellows. It was a deliberate attempt to ensure that their contribution was unmasked for the rest of the university, and it built their reputation hugely. Other parts of the university, quieter. And Sarah may well speak in the chat about how that shows up at Ulster University, which is where where Sarah sits. But I think it does differ, but I think just as engaging in fellowship differs across disciplines. And I think there's some language issues in there as well. Again, another one of my hobby horses is us persisting in talking about the need to be reflective, when that of itself puts people off in some disciplines, whereas if you speak about being evaluative, it actually draws people in. So I think the language of the PSF and the way we speak about it, our language, actually can be quite at risk of putting barriers up rather than pulling them down. Not sure if that answers it. I'm looking to see if Sarah's talking to help me out. She's lost her voice, which is very interesting, I think. As in not positive.
Sarah's just posted a comment there.
I knew she'd talk. Yeah, there we go.
So Sarah's saying professional services staff within faculties at times have seen a real difference made by having local champions.
Which is what that manager of the technicians did, that she got her senior fellowship first. She then championed it, and she made it possible, and she helped some of that demystifying, but also some of the benefits that come from engaging in the process. And I think that's something Sarah and I talk a lot about, is it's not just the end point, the getting the recognition, it's the process that supports it, which is enabling and liberating and is so important.
And there's also some chat going on in the conversation window to do with your PSF language point. So, for example, Monica's saying, I use the word analysis rather than reflection, as in computing. I'm guessing Monica's discipline. They're slightly allergic to the word reflection.
I mean, my background's nursing. Nursing was probably put into my blood about 30 years ago, but it isn't in everybody's. And we have to be really careful about the words that we use, that we think are normal words. And actually they're words that are unhelpful. And particularly for people who in professional services roles, and even that is a term that is probably not not working for some people who, because Tara and I try not to say not academics, you know, non-academics is like, you've just managed to other them, when actually what your intention was to include them. Okay, yeah. Right, yeah, there you go. So Sarah's talking about that co-creation that they did at Ulster University to ensure that the wording of the PSF just became more easy to get inside of. I love that way of thinking about language, of being able to get inside.
There was another point that was going on earlier on in the conversation where someone was making links to imposter syndrome and saying they've identified it as very high in these roles where they support people rather than actually being the kind of prime drivers of a module or something like that. Does that resonate with what you're observing?
Yeah, and I think one of the ways that you can work with that is by understanding the university, you know, through your own networks, is get some people who, you know, that if they gain their fellowship, it will help people realise that you're not an imposter, to come within it. You know, I remember conversations at Edinburgh Napier about a senior fellow who came from a quality background, and people doing that, oh my lord, you know, can somebody who's in a quality role actually be a senior fellow? And it, you know, for me, getting really antsy about it, and saying if they meet requirements, they meet requirements, you know, that when I furrow my brow and get a little bit cross with people, I think there is a sense in that some people might belong and some people don't. And I really think from an EDI perspective, we have to stop and question that. The idea that somebody who's in a professional service role really should be looking at associate fellow is really inappropriate way to be thinking about this. It depends on what they do, and it depends on how they can speak to it and also evidence their impact. And I think there's a lot of unconscious bias that goes on that we have to continually look out for in ourselves and in other people in an open conversation.
We've got time for a final question. Slightly different one. So does this culture of othering professional services staff, do you experience it filtering through to students?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that Sarah would talk about is the work that she's been leading, working in collaboration with Advance HE, about looking at how the PSF can actually have created within it a means of looking at students and what their roles are and how they can be recognised as meeting professional standard requirements. Now, Sarah would be able to talk about it and will happily take email conversations on that one. But yes, I think it does. The idea that students can be teachers, students can be facilitators of learning, students can be co-creators of a curriculum. I think we're still learning that students and the roles that they play are as important as our own, whoever we are. I'm not sure that answers your question, but it's for me, othering is something that we are doing all the time and commonly have no idea that we're doing it. I fall foul of it every day, at least once a day, probably 100 times.